Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. What if the biggest constraint on your organization's ability to navigate what's coming next isn't your technology, your funding, or your market? It's whether your leaders are actually equipped to think at the level the problem requires. My guest today spent 20 years in impact investment, watching well-resourced teams fail not because they lacked capital or talent, but because the people making the decisions weren't cognitively ready for the complexity in front of them. That observation became an obsession and eventually a platform. Logan Yonavjak is the co-founder of Readiness Engine, a tool that uses AI and developmental psychology to measure not what a leader has done, but how they think and whether they're ready for what's coming next. I'm your host, Adam Horner, CTO coach and founder of the CTO Playbook. Explore coaching, cohorts, and resources at thectoplaybook.com. Now let's meet Logan and hear all about her playbook. Logan, welcome to the CTO Playbook. It's great to have you here. For those of our audience who have not come across you before, it'd be really great if you could tell us just a little bit about yourself, a quick introduction to what it is that you do for leaders.
Absolutely. So I am someone who cares deeply about seeing better leadership outcomes and therefore seeing bigger impact and innovation outcomes in the world. I come from a field of investing, impact investing, that really looks at how businesses and investment firms can actually channel money towards nature and towards communities and really widen the aperture of how we think about the flow of capital and investing. So I spent about 20 years in the investing world in different roles. I've done early stage investing, worked for private equity, worked at a large investment bank. And so really just trying to better understand how capital flows. And all along the way, I was obviously unconsciously and consciously paying attention to leadership patterns. I saw a lot of sort of limiting beliefs around capitalism and the role of capitalism and being profit only, for instance, and people kind of seeing the role of business as just kind of strict business versus anything related to people and nature. So, there were just early kind of signals that I didn't necessarily see the type of visionary leadership that I thought was possible to bring capitalism into a different era. Because I'm very much a capitalist, but I believe it can do more bigger and greater things for humanity. So just saw teams not, very functional, people not in the right positions, people not ready for complexity, people thinking that they, very focused on like their sort of old way of doing things and not necessarily seeing possibility. So just a lot of those observations. And I just thought to myself, there's got to be a better way to develop leaders, to help leaders see themselves more accurately, to build teams and construct teams more effectively. So that's what we can talk about what I do now, but that's really what led me into an interest in leadership evaluation and development.
Excellent. There's so much to unpack here. It's going to be exciting. I'm looking forward to this because it covers quite a few things I'm very excited about myself. Leadership, obviously, but also business and flows of money, which obviously are very tightly bound together. There's the zero-sum game between or the perception of a zero-sum game between business and being good for folks. There's impact investment and what it is in the first place. So perhaps we should start off with a few basics to set a bit of a baseline for perhaps some of those more technical listeners who don't have the business knowledge. So from your perspective, how would you describe impact investment and why is it so important for us?
I think it's both intent-based and it's also about incorporating externalities that traditional capitalism doesn't incorporate. So in extractive models of capitalism, the idea is just you get as much as you can out of the system and you make as much money for shareholders as possible. In the impact orientation, typically, you're trying to internalize some of the costs of externalities, things like pollution, impacts on workers, things like that. And so you're trying to bake that into the investment model and widen the aperture of how your investment is going to impact communities and nature. That doesn't mean you make less money. There's many examples of companies that have been very successful building products or cutting costs around or reducing risks associated with natural capital or communities and things like that. So I think for me, it's just an understanding that there's more to the equation than profit first, profit
Yeah.
only. So yeah, that's how I would answer that, the impact question.
And where do you think this perception of there is either business or there is good for folks as a sort of a trade-off against each other rather than something that can coexist, where do you think that really comes from in people's perception?
I think until recently, I don't know that I had a crisp answer to that. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with people's upbringing, cultural underpinnings, experiences people have had around. I mean, if you want to get really deep with it, I think it comes down to love and fear based living. I think we can source a lot of people's decisions based on kind of where they're coming from, a constricted or a more abundant perspective. And that can lead to a lot of different outcomes on either side. But more practically speaking, I guess I would say that there's actually developmental stages you can map in someone. So adults tend to evolve along a trajectory. And what developmental psychology can do is actually look at stages of adult development. This is a whole body of psychology and organizational psychology that has existed for about 40 years. And what's been challenging until now is actually measuring that in the sense of measuring it at scale. So how researchers used to look at developmental stages is they would have someone sit down and answer some questions and they would score them using human scoring mechanisms. So we would sit down with your transcript and we would actually score by hand.
So would this make it a kind of a subjective measure then rather than something that's quite objective?
Well, there's objective ways to score in that just because humans are doing it, didn't mean to imply it was not
Okay.
objective. It's just more that it's laborious.
Right.
But what you're actually measuring is sentence structure or keyword based. And you're looking at how someone references experiences they've had, how they hold paradox, how many perspectives they're bringing in, how they relate to others, and how they talk about, their relationship with the external world in a variety of different ways. There's a lot more to it than that, but to boil it down, that's what we're doing with AI. And so going back to your original question, when someone is not necessarily as able to do paradoxical thinking, it means they're at a lower stage of development. So they tend to see things as black or white versus being able to hold multiple perspectives. And that's what I think is really happening with the impact investing space, is that we're seeing a lot more people being able to hold the paradox of, why can't we do both? Why can't we do good and have financial return at the same time? And what are seeing into possibilities of how to do that versus being limited by the perspective that you can only have one or the other.
Right. And there must be a historical element to this as well, where in times gone by, there were natural resources available. They were probably finite in absolute terms, but in people's perception, there was absolutely loads of it. The woods, the stone that we can mine, etc., large amounts of it. So it seemed infinite, but in reality, on the large scale, it's actually finite. And so therefore, extractive kind of business was kind of a default way of doing business up until probably 50, 60, 70 years ago, when we began to see limitations, notably around oil, I think was probably one of the first ones where it gained collective consciousness. Do you think that impacts the way that people think in business even to this day?
Yeah, I think I wish that we had an evolutionary biologist on the call, because my mom's actually one. I should have this conversation with her. Yeah, I think there are physiological reasons why humans have evolved the way they have. I don't feel like I'm the most equipped person to kind of speak to some of those markers, but it seems like in general, we've evolved from having like a limbic brain to a neocortex, which is obviously moving from more instinctual patterns of response to being able to hold more complexity and have executive conscious functioning in making decisions. It seems like the ability to see complexity might be some sort of evolutionary benefit that some people kind of, it was sort of a trait or a set of traits that started taking off, and for various reasons, certain people kept going with it and it had evolutionary benefit. So there's probably a lot of reasons why the majority of the population stays more fixed and cautious, while some other people are more willing to take risks and go out in a sort of frontier exploratory way. But I would love to have that conversation with the right people, because I think you're right. There's like deep roots here. But I think in the information economy, we do at least have more access to possibilities and ways of validating information that we've never had before. So in theory, if those with the ability to hold complexity are getting access to the right information, we could make better decisions. So we need to identify those people who do have that tendency for certain roles, for certain visionary roles, so that they can be armed with the right information so they can be informed and hopefully make, more equipped decisions.
And I guess that's where I was coming from. So it isn't something that's like a fixed mindset that we have. It is
No.
something that as leaders we can develop in ourselves. What would you consider to be the sort of steps to progress ourselves along this way?
Yeah. Well, also our brains are very plastic. That's been proven as well that habits can be changed. You just have to have the right mindset. And so I would say coachability is probably the most important of the fundamental constructs that we look at. If you don't have that growth mindset going in, it's very hard to evolve yourself. And so those who kind of come from more of a fixed mentality, like, oh, people don't change, or this is always how it's been done. It's more difficult to get those people off of that position versus somebody who comes in and says, oh yeah, it's all up for grabs. Like I'm open to all, I'm flexible. And so I think, if I were to say what moves the needle most for people, it's being coachable fundamentally. But then there are techniques and practices, a lot of it's understanding your baseline. So that's why we advocate doing this work to begin with. So you understand your own developmental baseline. And then from there are half steps to full steps you can take over time. And they're usually 6 months to a year. It's not necessarily always the fastest. It's not immediate gratification usually, but typically, I'll use one example. So we evaluated a founder. So we measure 6 main things, but he was very relationally oriented and adept, and he had a high developmental score relationally. So he was very good at empathizing. He loved listening to other people, very good at sort of making the team feel psychologically safe. But when it came to pivoting quickly, he struggled with that aspect of things because when it came time for him to make a decision, he didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings or contradict anyone. So when we recommended his developmental pathway, we looked at, okay, how can you first ask yourself reflective questions when you're at a position where you have to make a decision? How do you identify, okay, I'm in this position now? And so you're consciously aware. And then how do you develop techniques to stay accountable when you have the information to actually make that decision? So that might be a coach, that might be having a COO who's very process oriented, who's like, we got to meet these quarterly goals and you have to decide. So it depends on the person and their context, but there's just generally it's a combination of identifying where you are in that habit and then like what you need around you to keep you accountable to grow.
Got it. So there's an element of push and there's an element of accountability or standard to hit in terms of expectations.
Yeah.
Cool. And in terms of how that fits into the larger business picture, because clearly over the last, several years, maybe even decades, you've sort of realized this is crucially, centrally important to the kinds of businesses that you've previously provided funded for and to the way they work. How did you come to that position? What were sort of the key moments where you sort of realized this is a leadership problem rather than anything to do with the funding, to do with the market, to do with anything else?
Well, I've met people all along the way, whether personally or professionally, who, for instance, one of the biggest things I've noticed is people not being afraid to ask for help, being an extremely limiting factor, like this element of pride and saying, oh, I can do all of it myself, really limits opportunities because you need other people. If that's your foundational belief, you need other people to accomplish anything. It's very Ayn Rand to be like I'm a staunch libertarian and, I am self-reliant and nothing, there's not like systems of people organized to help me. I read Ayn Rand, so that was also influential, but I felt that there was this lack of, a lot of people surprisingly wouldn't ask for help in times when there seemed like there was an opportunity to partner or there was an opportunity to have someone else take on a role that we weren't as good at. And so I saw that come up a lot, which is a pride issue in many ways, a fixed kind of mentality. I can do it all myself. And then a lack of often blaming other people. So not necessarily taking responsibility for the role that you play in the interaction. Like conflict arises and the tendency could be to just blame the other people that you're working with or partners for not meeting expectations versus reflecting like what role did I play in
And
having
taking
that.
that personal
Yeah.
accountability for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are
Okay.
two things I noticed a lot.
And I guess you must have seen those in sort of patterns over time then. So where was the sort of the switch, the pivot going from observing and seeing these things to thinking, I can do something about this?
Well, it was a couple different, I mean, in one area, I've always had an interest in Jungian psychology from a young age. So I was exposed to some leadership assessments, the MBTI being the first one probably. But I've been exposed to many leadership assessments, and I didn't think they were very effective in necessarily doing anything but snapshotting me. Like they didn't really have a developmental roadmap.
Yeah.
And I
And so for those people that aren't familiar, the MBTI is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, if I remember
Yes, the
correctly.
Myers-Briggs, yes.
Yeah.
I love the theory behind it, but I don't think the test itself is. And then if you take it, this was something I noticed. I would type someone in my head because I'm pretty good at it, and they would be wildly off what they actually were when it came to the test, the results. They would think they were X, like an extrovert, and they were, no, that's not the best example. They would think that they were very analytically inclined when actually they were very relationally inclined. And that happened a lot. And there was some gender bias with that. So I just saw a lot of, when it's self-reported, I think people have a lot of blind spots that are difficult to showcase in an assessment tool. So I just saw a lot of limitations from that angle. And then I went to a top business school, and I thought the leadership program, the assessments they used weren't also that useful. And so I just started thinking, like, with AI, developmental psychology, and then I met my co-founder. I just wondered, could we develop something for the new era of leadership with all the disruption coming? And it started with the early stage investment community, like trying to target them to make better deployment decisions and then help grow founders over time.
Okay, so some of the issue wasn't necessarily with the theory of the way, for example, Myers-Briggs or any of these other mechanisms try and pigeonhole people into certain types, but more the assessment, the test for it. Because one of the frequent criticisms of these is that the tests themselves can be gamed. In fact, if you kind of know a little bit about it, you can kind of almost put yourself in any one of the 16 boxes that puts you into. So is that fair, the way you're thinking about it in terms of the testing rather than the theory?
Well, I think the Myers-Briggs is probably the one I understand the most about the theory. Some of the other ones I would say are just missing vertical development. So that's the body of research I mentioned earlier that has to do with how adults develop in stages over time, developmental stages. That sort of vertical component was missing in most of the assessments I've taken. And so I think
that's sort of temporal element of how things adjust over time, and of course how experiences stack into new sort of knowledge foundations.
And how people grow. So I think they're limited in how that they're self-reported. They're easier to game, and then they're not incorporating this developmental component.
So tell us a little bit, Matt, then, because you mentioned your co-founder there. What was it that they brought to the picture, and what do you do now? How is it different from what's come before?
Yeah, so what's amazing about my co-founder is he's a data scientist and a clinical psychologist by training and also has an MBA. So has just a very interdisciplinary, I think some of the best solutions come from interdisciplinary minds. And so he's really able to traverse a lot of territory. And it was him that brought in the developmental psychology piece. I more had the idea to bring an assessment tool into the investment industry. And he said, well, listen, there's this whole body of work that hasn't been really brought into the fold yet for various reasons. And so one of them being that laborious human scoring component I mentioned. So he thought, well, the time might be ripe for this. And so, and thankfully we get along really well and have a good working relationship. So there's all these things that have to come together to start a company. But I'm very grateful to him because I'm certainly more on the, corporate strategy, fundraising, sales side, and he's the CTO. So
Got it. Okay. And so what is it that your platform fundamentally does? I mean, you mentioned sort of the manual scoring of, I presume, of transcripts and conversations. How are those set up? How does the scoring itself work? And what do you end up with as somebody who's being assessed?
So what we're trying to do is help companies. So I think there's kind of two layers to it. One is we're trying to help companies make more informed decisions that will lead to better business outcomes. So if people are more engaged at work, if you have people in the right roles and they're lit up because they're able to perform at their highest capacity, they're working with team members who are competent and have complementary skills. I mean, those are all things that are going to make your company perform better. You're going to reach those quarterly goals. You're going to see possibilities where there weren't before. You're not going to be mired by friction and people quitting and all sorts of other issues. So at
So
the
in terms
end,
of the aims then, so just to try and capture some of that, the idea here then is to help with team composition, role selection or specification,
yeah.
rather than, for example, a recruiting approach or a selection approach. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, most selection is based on what have you done before, warm intros, some obviously resumes and what your competencies are as a professional, but it doesn't necessarily demarcate like whether you're ready for more complexity, whether you're good at relationally working with others, some of these other factors that are, I guess, considered somewhat soft skills, although we measure cognitive complexity. So we're looking at more of the whole person and where they fit best in a team. And we're also helping, I think, incentive wise. Yeah, we're not a recruitment agency, so we're not getting incentivized by that piece, in
Got it.
terms of the placement fee. And so we're trying to remove barriers to just selecting the right people for the right jobs and constructing teams properly.
Cool. And so what does the analysis or the assessment itself look like? So if I was, say, for example, you're going to give me a test, what would it look like? What would I have to do to go through the test?
So you can either sit down and take a 45-minute one-way video assessment. Why we do that is we're looking at reducing the ability to game. So we're looking at scenario-based questions that are open-ended. So you speak into a camera about experiences you've had, and we're watching to see whether or not you're reading off of a script or rehearsing, things like that. We're not at this point looking at behavioral cues or tone or anything like that. It's really just the transcript data.
And so when you say one way, am I sort of reading something and then speaking based off what I read?
Yeah.
Questions, scenarios, that kind of thing? Okay.
Yeah. Or the other way we can do it is you can send us a pile of transcript documents, like call notes, things like that, and then we can run a lot of the same analysis as long as we can identify who's speaking.
Got it. Okay. So if I was to use, for example, the transcripts of my podcast, there might be a place you could start from with assessment. Very interesting. Okay, cool. And then once I've done that assessment, once you've taken it through your process, what do I get back and what do I learn from it?
The real gold mine is the results. And so we give like a report that is designed to really give like intervention strategies for each person. And we try to keep it at 3 because not to overcomplicate people's lives. And so it'll show you like, how do you get to that next level? Well, here's kind of 3 main things to focus on. And then we have interactive dashboards that we're continuing to work on. We even want to gamify this whole process so it's more fun for people to grow and to continue to evolve their developmental levels. And so it's really a combination of reports and dashboards that we deliver. Plus, we have coaching for those who really want that accountability. We have a roster of coaches that we can bring in.
Got it. Okay. So then the onward step from here is either a list of sort of self-development, personal development things that I can work through, and I may or may not choose to work with a coach to work with that further myself along those goals, I presume.
Yeah. And then we can do team analyses, which look at the overlap between capabilities of different team members.
Now, that's something that I've seen companies charge rather a lot for in the past. It's something that's been sort of quite seen as, when it's done well, it's incredibly valuable and very useful for a leadership team, especially. The more senior the leadership team, the more valuable it tends to be for them.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've very recently added in, or is that something that was one of the goals from the beginning?
We definitely wanted that. That's one of the things we've heard highest demand for is really the team analysis, because obviously in many contexts we're you are working on a team. I have this whole piece about we can or cannot get into about developing AI agents as well. But I think there would be some really cool possibilities in actually, thinking about yourself as your highest version. Like think about the angel on your shoulder and using developmental psychology to build out that agent that's your second brain into
Right.
your best version of yourself. And then having it be able to inform decision making for you and also role play with other team members on different high stakes scenarios from like your highest version of yourself.
Interesting. So getting into the sort of meta version of how we will be working in a few years' time, once many people have got to that stage of creating the second brain.
Right. But it's coming from their own current developmental perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So for those people who aren't that familiar with it, do you want to just give us a quick outline of what the second brain is, that we're all going off the same basis for it?
Yeah. Well, the way I think about it is I'm teaching AI to think like me and make decisions like me and inform how I think from my own perspective, meaning what have I written before? What frameworks am I using? How do I tend to relate to other people? And it's mimicking that so that it can perform certain tasks in my stead. And I give it permission to do certain things. But it's coming from my current level of development. So wouldn't it be amazing if I could say, well, I want Logan's highest self to be in the room for this, because this is a weak area of mine and I'm finding myself in this pattern, or it'll raise that. It'll say, hey, it looks like you're kind of facing this weak area in your how you tend to do things. Why don't you do it this way instead? Or consider this,
Got it. So using the AI capabilities along with the context that you give it for where you are right now to help you level up, almost like self-coaching.
Yeah.
Awesome. And is that something that you see as a major part of the future of leadership and of personal development?
I mean, I think there will be early adopters like with anything else, but it seems like we're on that trajectory, and those who are willing to build a second brain, which it seems like decent. I don't have numbers on this, but anecdotally, it seems like about a third of my friends and colleagues have done so far. And how long has AI been around to the public? A couple years.
5 years, basically. Yeah.
So it seems natural that we could build in some of these kinds of capabilities. And I think role playing and lower entry points for coaching are in high demand. Like I think the thing that I've heard people use AI the most for is personal relationship questions. And so it seems to me that there's a need for something like this where people don't have to spend $300 to $500 an hour on a coach. Not to say there won't be human coaches, but just something more accessible to the everyday person. And why not have it build in your highest, potential?
Yeah.
As one feature.
Because one of the things that I'm seeing in my own coaching when I'm working with other CTOs is that there's a growing demand, number one, for coaching, which is fantastic to see, because one of the things I've been lamenting for a long time is that there's rarely do I find CTOs who have, for example, their own budget to spend on their own personal development. Mm-hmm. But also because of that, people tend to be less open to the very concept and idea of coaching. And actually, once I start talking to people and sort of say, well, coaching is an option. Coaching is something that you can and should do. There's sort of this realization moment of, oh, that's actually possible for me, because it's always been considered to be available for CEOs, company leaders, but founders, but rarely for somebody who's at the CTO level or come from the technical background. Part of that is historical, right? You're the tech guy, you go find your answers on Stack Overflow, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But I think there is also this growing realization that coaching is a multiplier rather than just an additive. So mm-hmm. in terms of what you're saying here about doing an assessment of where you could be going next from the point of view of an objective analysis of the way that you think, the way that you talk, and then also here's a version of you stepped up just a bit, but not like massively, so that it doesn't feel like an intimidating jump, to help people to grow without the formality of a coach. And yet that being introduction to coaching, I think is a fantastic thing.
Because some people almost have an aversion to talking to, and this is a cultural thing too, I've noticed, and not to overgeneralize, but in certain cultures, people are even more allergic to therapy or coaching. Like they just see that as a weakness, reaching out to, again, the asking for help
Asking for help,
piece.
yeah.
Could we give people a sense of what they could accomplish with a coach, with just an AI coach, reflecting back to them a little bit, and then sort of that being an entry point to other coaching. So I don't know. I think that it's definitely worth a try. And these are the kinds of experiments that I think we're in a position that in society where we can start running and seeing hopefully some good results.
And that's probably a good segue to ask you the question about where do you see your work going next? What do you see the evolution of these assessments in the near future?
Well, I don't like to think of us as an assessment company. I feel like we're providing leadership analytics so that people can make more informed decisions about who's leading and what teams are in place so
Right.
that we can have a brighter future for humanity. I think developmental capacity has been holding back a lot of positive outcomes for society, and it's been limiting what people think is possible from capitalism. And so I just see a brighter future where we have leaders who can hold that complexity and paradox and hopefully make more informed decisions.
So full circle back to the impact investment bid.
Yeah, from a different angle, instead of impact measurement and going into the weeds about like the impacts on nature, which are very important, I just was like, what if we start with the leaders, themselves and their mindset and their self-reflection and where they're coming from? It seems like a lot's trickling from that. So,
And what would you see as sort of evidence, if you like, in a few years' time that you are actually having an impact on leadership, your approach, your ideas are propagating out throughout leadership?
yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, adoption of the tools is a somewhat more straightforward way to think about that, but I think we'll see more job satisfaction. We'll see less turnover. We'll see more satisfied employees. And that will hopefully lead to, I'd love to see corporations having mission statements that were more broad, that had like society in mind, that had nature in mind. There are some of them, but I think for the most part, we're still trying to myopically think about just return for shareholders. And so I'm hopeful that more companies will see what they're doing as more focused on communities and nature. So that's one thing. And yeah, I think some of the more business focused kind of immediate is seeing less company turnover or employee turnover, more job satisfaction, more engaged employees, meeting goals that they set out, that the company sets out, meeting strategy. So yeah.
Good. And it seems like in some ways it's sort of returned to the time when people had a job for a lot longer. Some people used to have jobs that today is as long as a career.
30, 40 years, I know. Well, we're also all becoming managers, if you think about it. We're all managing agents now to some degree or another. A lot of the mundane work that people have been subject to in different roles is kind of being allocated to AI. And so it's going to force a lot of us. I think there's going to be a lot of disruption, obviously it already is, but it's going to force a lot of people to think about, like, what do I want to do? And how do we think about the role of humans being more on the visionary side, or more on the holding complexity, or more on the relational intelligence piece of, the equation, instead of these rote tasks that AI can accomplish for us. So
Absolutely.
it's an exciting time to be in business, and also sort of overwhelming at the same time.
There is a lot going on. It can feel intimidating at times, can't it? But I do think there's something here in you pushing back against the impacts of the quarterly report from public markets that have created this sort of short-termism to begin to help people to look longer term. Because as coaches, it's always one of the things we're doing is, what do you look like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years time? It's one of those things people I find have had more and more of a struggle to think further ahead as things are happening faster and faster and faster. The cycle of business is going quicker. People tend to be even more myopic about where they're looking for themselves, for their businesses. And I think your approach is part of this idea of let's stretch out our consciousness a little bit further ahead in terms of where we're going. So I do love the idea as well of just keeping the things that you can work on to 3 rather than intimidating with all the things you could do.
Yeah. I think from also just levers in the system to pull. I would love to see more investors taking assessments like this or thinking more about their leadership capacity, because they're the ones deciding on where capital is going, especially in the private markets. Who gets what managers, what founders, what teams are getting allocated to. And if we could pick teams that were more focused on complexity and solving problems for society and not focused on such short-termism, I just think things would start to tip more in the favor of impact and innovation in a good way. So
excellent. Well, that's probably a good point at which to help people understand what the actual testing process and approach would be like in order to get to that point where we can leverage our leadership further going forwards. So just to summarize then, so that the first stage is literally to either do the interview assessment or to do the submission of a bunch of text. Is that right? And then from there, a report.
5 to 7 days, we get a report,
right,
and a dashboard. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And then from there, it's then that it's a few things you can work on, or indeed do that as part of a team rather than individual to give a, what does that give you? A sort of a more holistic team-wide approach to the whole team development, I presume.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. What URL would people go to start that, Logan?
readinessengine.io. So www.readinessengine.io. And there's a contact form there. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with us.
Excellent. And if anyone wants to continue this conversation with you personally, is LinkedIn a good place for people to go to?
Yes, absolutely. It's Logan Yonavjak on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. And we can put links to those in the show notes. Logan, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's been great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favor in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on the CTOplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.